like the waves that come crashing on my shore. Come like a thief, come knocking at my door.
Good morning, church, and welcome to week 2 of our Lenten series, Empty and Filled, discovering the meaning and power of Lent. This week we're looking at the topic of fasting. It's been said that fasting is the kale of the spiritual disciplines. We know it's good for us, but we don't seek it out on the menu. And I've got to be honest with you, I can relate with this quote. Even though I know fasting is beneficial for me, there's nothing in me, if I'm going to be completely honest, that feels like fasting. It's not something we generally feel like doing. That's why it's called a spiritual discipline. I mean, I enjoy my comforts. Maybe you do as well. I enjoy the feeling of instant gratification. I feel like eating and I'm privileged to be in a place where I can grab some food and eat it if I feel like it. I think we all take this for granted. But what we're going to see today is that fasting is actually a good and proper spiritual discipline. It's a tool that we can use to draw close to God's heart. So let's start off with the question of why fast? Why even do it in the first place? Well, last week in Luke chapter 4, we saw that Jesus was fasting and praying as he was tempted in the wilderness. So I guess as a baseline, if it was good enough for Jesus, then it should be good enough for us. Case closed, end of sermon. Not too fast. It's often linked alongside prayer. As I said, it's a tool, and it's a tool that Jesus used. But to be honest, when I came to faith in my early 20s, I started hearing about fasting, and quite a few of my friends were fasting, and just to be honest, I found it really confusing. It seemed like a good thing to do, but the confusing thing was that I found it hard to figure out practically what to do, how to fast. When my friends were doing it, they were doing it for different periods of time. They were doing it with different things. I wanted to find sort of a how-to list in teaching me how to fast. I wanted some boxes to tick so that I knew that I was doing it right, so that I could please God somehow by doing this thing that he said was good. So I searched the scriptures, and what I found was actually a bunch of scriptures that tended to make me more confused. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says, when you fast. Not if, but when. Jesus speaks about it as an expectation, as something that still pleases God. But then just a couple of chapters later in Matthew chapter 9, there's a big discussion between John's disciples and Jesus where they ask Jesus, why do we and the Pharisees fast, but you and your disciples don't do it? Jesus says, the wedding guests don't fast while the bridegroom is still with them. So do we or don't we? There's a bunch of Old Testament scriptures that talk about prayer and fasting going together, as I said before. And again, it seems like an expectation. It seems like something that God thinks is important and says that we should do. But then in that, there's different ways of fasting. In Daniel chapter 1, Daniel fasts from eating meat. He eats a vegetarian diet for a period of time. And that was because the king's meat had been sacrificed to idols, and so Daniel didn't feel within himself that he could eat this meat with a clear conscience, and so he didn't. God seemed happy with his fasting. There's today's reading from Isaiah chapter 58 that seems to tell us not to bother fasting food if it's just going to make us hangry, but to do good deeds instead. We're going to look at that a bit more in a minute. There's heaps more passages that we could look at, But at the end of all of this, I just had to stop and say to God, I need some wisdom. If this is something that's important to you, please teach me how to do it. Teach me how to do it in a way that's going to be pleasing to you. I remember just a few days after I prayed this prayer to God, it was still very fresh on my mind. A mate, Johnny, invited me round to his house with a bunch of our other mates for a barbecue. It was an absolute feast. There was food everywhere. Johnny was cooking a barbecue. There was piles of meat. And I was still wrestling with this idea of fasting. I was wrestling with the idea of this seems like an abundance. Where does fasting fit in the midst of this when we're having such a good time of fellowship and laughter together? And I remember watching Johnny, and he was serving us all night. He was just making sure that we were having such a good time, that we were all fed well. And then after a while, I noticed that Johnny himself wasn't eating. Another friend told me at that point that Johnny was actually in the midst of a 21-day long fast. Prayer and fasting for 21 days, only liquids, no food. It turned out that Johnny had used his unused food budget, the money that he would normally have spent on feeding himself. He'd used that money to throw us, his friends, a party so that we could enjoy the food even though he wasn't eating it. And I thought to myself at that point, wow, is this the heart of fasting? Is this what it's all about? The joy of the Lord was literally Johnny's strength. God was Johnny's sustenance as he willingly and joyfully served us, his friends. I realized at that point that my confusion around fasting was something that the Israelites had also seemed to struggle with. How do I tick a box? How do I do fasting right? How do I make God happy? Rather than asking the question that I should have been asking, what's getting in my way from totally relying on God? Fasting is not about making God happy. It's not about making him love me more. Fasting is not something that God needs. It's something that we need. We need to realign our hearts with God. Our hearts tend not to rely on God. We rely on other comforts and leisures and our own sufficiency. And so fasting is a way of getting back to that baseline and saying, God, you are all I need. I'd been asking the wrong questions. And this is what God is addressing in today's reading that we had in church, Isaiah chapter 58. If you have a Bible with you or your phone or something, turn to Isaiah chapter 58. We're looking specifically at verses 1 to 8. In verse 2, God says to the Israelites, Isaiah 58 verse 2, "Day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways." Notice that word seem. They seem eager to know my ways. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. They seem eager to do all these things. But then we see the people's grumbling. They saying to God, "Why have we fasted and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed?" Or in other words, why have we bothered fasting when you're not going to give us what we want anyway? That might tell us a little bit about their motivation, about their hearts. And so God replies by giving this honest verdict. This is the reason God gives for not noticing their fasting. He says, "On the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists." And so God goes on to say, don't bother. Don't bother. Get your hearts right with God and get your hearts right with your neighbour before you even think about coming back. Do good deeds. Love the people around you. Because what this tells us is that the Israelites' motivation was all wrong. They are pretending to do the right things when they're in the temple, but back at home it's ugly and driven by anger. Their motivation is to get what they want from God. And when they don't get what they want, they complain against him. They treat him like a genie in a bottle. They're trying to get their wishes answered, thinking that by fasting they're going to bend God's arm into doing what they want. It's not how it works. Fasting is not some sort of magic. Rather, fasting is about drawing close to God's heart. Fasting is about receiving God's heart, not the other way around. And so this is what fasting is all about. Intentionally creating space that is free from luxury and distractions and drawing close into God's heart. Fasting is a matter of the heart, not a matter of deeds. Fasting is a tool to help us realign our hearts with God's. And so it's a helpful thing for us to ask, what are the things in our life that are distracting us from God? This is the question that we need to ask. I might put it another way. What are the things that fill up your time and suffocate your prayer life? What are they? I've got a little list here that might get us started. TV. Does sitting in front of the TV suffocate your prayer time? Social media. Do you get lost scrolling down that Facebook or Instagram rabbit hole? Does social media suffocate your God time? Other things can do the same thing in suffocating our time with God. It can be things like leisure time, relaxation time, work time, even family time. Now, all of these things are good God-given gifts, but when we allow these God-given gifts to distract us from God himself, when they take away from our relationship with God himself, there must be a realigning. These are gifts given by God to be used in communion with God. We fast from these things not because God is going to be impressed with our sacrifice, but we fast because we want to create an intentional space in our day to draw close to God's heart. Now, we can't always fast from food, and sometimes it's just not medically safe to fast from food. But if you can, fasting from food is a good and proper spiritual discipline. There's nothing quite like a hungry stomach to drive you to your knees in prayer. Each time you feel your tummy growl, get on your knees and pray instead. I mean, I've gone through seasons where I've been much more diligent in fasting than at other times. And to be honest, the latest season has not been a time where I've been diligent in this. But just as an example, in different ways to fast, sometimes I've followed the practice of just skipping one meal. Just picking one meal, breakfast, lunch or dinner, and just doing that one day a week. Sometimes I've followed the practice that our Muslim brothers and sisters do during Ramadan. They fast from the daylight hours, and so they eat before sun up and they eat after sunset. Sometimes I've done that. Other times I've fasted for consecutive days, fasting food and only having liquids. But recently, Sarah and I, we noticed that our phone time was just becoming really healthy. We'd sit down at the end of a busy day and we were just completely wiped, and we'd just sit on the couch, just scrolling, and it was really unhealthy, and it was literally suffocating our God time, and it was suffocating our marriage time. And so on our phones, we both went in there into the focus bit and we set limits so that our phone would turn itself off, so that the apps would cut themselves off after a particular amount of time. This has been good and healthy. This has been a good and healthy way of fasting for us. It's been good for our marriage, and it's been good for our relationship with God. This is a way that we felt we needed to fast. When it comes to work, fasting from work seems like a funny one, but a mate posted just the other day that during Lent he's fasting work, and so he's gone on a 7-day holiday with his family. But when we think about it, when we work long hours, when we work overtime, what's usually the first thing to go? What's the first thing that gets pushed to the side? Well, I know for me, it's my God time. It's my God time. When I work long hours, even though I'm doing good things for God, sometimes my work can just completely suffocate my personal time with God, and it affects my family and it affects my health. Sometimes we need to fast from work. We need to fast overtime and get back into healthy rhythms again. This was actually one of the original ways of fasting. God said, take a Sabbath. Take a Sabbath. That's a way of fasting work. God said, take a day off to worship me. Take a day off for some you and God time. Whatever it is. Whether it's work, whether it's social media, whether it's TV, whether it's just reading other books, whatever it is that's suffocating your relationship with God, get rid of it. Fast from it. Throw it away. And draw close to God. This brings us to the point that fasting is not just something for Lent. In fact, you might be going through the season of Lent and you've slowed down enough and you're creating some intentional spaces and you're like, I actually don't feel like I need to fast right now. But maybe something on later in the year is just really poking your heart and saying, you need to take some time to realign. For this reason, fasting is actually a lifestyle. It's an intentional way of living that says, I'm not a slave to anyone or anything other than God. Nothing is taking control of my life. It is a life laid down completely before the cross. It's a lifestyle, a choice that we make as disciples of Christ. To say, I'm not a slave to my stomach. I'm not a slave to social media or to TV. I'm not a slave to my work. I am not a machine. I'm a human that's created in the image of God, and I serve my Creator and Him alone. Friends, this is the heart of fasting. This is what fasting is all about. And for me, it's summed up in our psalm that we had this morning. It's one of the most beautiful verses in the whole scriptures. Psalm 27, verse 4. It says this, I have asked one thing from the Lord. It is what I desire, to dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, gazing on the beauty of the Lord and seeking Him in His temple. Friends, as we continue to wrestle through this topic together, I'm giving our congregation time in our service to think through these questions. And you might want to pause this video now and answer these two questions for yourself. What are the things that distract us from God? What are the things that distract you from God, that suffocate your God time? And how can we live a lifestyle of fasting and seek to pursue God every day? What are some practical ways that we can live this out? Friends, as we think about fasting, there's 5 things that I've found helpful, and I'd like to just share them with you. These are not taken directly from the scriptures, but I believe they're definitely scripturally based. So thinking about fasting, 5 things I've found helpful. Number 1, pray and ask God. Fasting is all about drawing close to God, and so we must remember that fasting is always couched in prayer and relationship with God. And so pray and ask God. Just say, God, I want to draw close to you. Show me how. When God points something out, be willing to obey. Be willing to listen. Point B under this one is, don't wait until you feel like it. You're not going to feel like fasting. It's the kale of the spiritual disciplines. You won't feel like it, so just seek God. Seek him. Say, God, I want to draw close to you. I don't feel like fasting, but can you just draw me into this space and teach me how to do it? Point something out in my life that's keeping me from being with you. Point 2, plan it. Start small and manageable. This might seem a bit rigid, but it's really helpful to prepare yourself. When we're fasting, what we're trying to do is to carve out time in the midst of our day. And so it's really helpful to plan it so that we can clear our diary as much as we can, so that we can actually we're not being torn in all different directions. We're creating a space in our day, in our week, where we can spend that time intentionally with God. Don't feel like you need to bite off more than you can chew straight away. Start small, start manageable, plan it out. As you're thinking through this, it might be helpful, point 3, to be accountable to someone. If you're living with someone, telling them is actually just good manners, because you might be grumpy, you might need prayer, and you might need help. You might need support. So be accountable to someone. You don't need to tell them everything, and you don't need to shout it to the world, but just say to someone close to you that you can trust, say, hey, I'm fasting, and I just love you to be able to pray with me and support me in this and keep me accountable. Point 4 is to replace emptiness with fullness. This means that when we are fasting, when we're creating an empty space, for instance, if we're fasting lunch, we don't just keep working through lunch. We stop and we fill it with something filling, like reading the scriptures and prayer, listening to worship music. If we're fasting lunch, we don't just go onto social media and waste time. We fill it with God's space. Remember that when we fast a meal, we're not just talking about 15 minutes. When we sit down to have breakfast or lunch or dinner, what we're talking about is actually like 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how much time you take normally for a meal. And so when you're fasting a meal, don't just give God 5 minutes. Take some extended time out to pray and worship. Talking 30 minutes, 1 hour. You don't need to speak for all that time. In fact, I just suggest that you get on the couch, put some worship music on, and just allow God to speak to you instead. The money that you would have spent on food, you don't need to cook me a barbecue like Johnny did. You might want to give it to missions. You might want to use it for something that's going to glorify God. And so use the money that you've saved to spend on people in need. And the final point that might be helpful, remember God's grace is sufficient. It's called a spiritual discipline for a reason. Again, it's not easy. We're not going to get this perfect, but the good thing is that God is after your heart, not your perfection. And so when you stuff it up, when you say, I'm going to fast for this meal, and then just by habit you happen to walk past the cupboard and grab a cookie or some chips or something like that, don't beat yourself up. Don't beat yourself up. God's grace is sufficient. Run to him instead. Start again and just say, God, in my frailty, I'm finding this real hard. Just continue to teach me how to rely on you for all of my needs. And so, friends, these are 5 things that might help you as you think through fasting and its implications in your life and practically how you might live it out. To finish up our service this morning, I invite you to pray Psalm 27, verse 4, along with me. Let's pray. I have asked one thing from the Lord. It is what I desire, to dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, gazing on the beauty of the Lord and seeking him in his temple. Amen.
Come like the